In the middle of World War II, a town of just 10,000 people was quietly producing more than 500 million eggs every single year. If Petaluma, California had stopped shipping eggs for just a few weeks, breakfast across the western United States would have felt it. But almost nobody today knows that this place once controlled one of America's most important food supplies. This is the story of how a small river town in Northern California turned chickens into a machine and became the egg basket of the world. Welcome to Niche NorCal, where we uncover the strange, forgotten, and unbelievable stories hidden in Northern California. In January of 1942, as American troops were landing across the Pacific and Europe was being pulled into the largest war in human history, a federal photographer named Russell Lee walked into a brightly lit room in a small California town called Petaluma. On the tables in front of him were thousands of eggs. They were being lifted, one by one, to a powerful light. Every shell was examined, every yolk checked, every flaw rejected. The image he took, a woman holding an egg to a glowing lamp in a spotless packing plant, looks almost calm, almost peaceful. But what that photo actually represents is something much stranger. Because at that moment, in the middle of World War II, the United States had become quietly dependent on one tiny river town for one of its most important food supplies, Petaluma, California. In 1939, just 3 years before that photograph was taken, Petaluma produced 45 million dozen eggs. That's 540 million individual eggs, from a town of about 10,000 people. To understand how absurd that number is, you have to step back for a moment. At the time, California's population was only about 7 million people. Petaluma alone was producing enough eggs to give every single person in the state more than 70 eggs per year from one town. And it wasn't a fluke year. It wasn't a lucky harvest. It was a system. Eggs were leaving Petaluma every day by the trainload, bound for San Francisco, Los Angeles, and markets across the western United States. They were inspected, graded, packed, refrigerated, and shipped with the precision of a factory product. This wasn't what most people think of when they imagine farming in the early 1900s. This was industrial agriculture before anyone had a word for it, and Petaluma was at the center of it. But it didn't start that way. In the 1850s and 60s, Petaluma was just another California river town. Redwood logs floated down the Petaluma River. Milk came from nearby dairies. Wheat grew in the surrounding hills. Chickens wandered behind houses, scratching for scraps. Eggs were something you got from your neighbor, not from a national supply chain. Most hens only laid part of the year. They only hatched chicks when they felt like it. If a fox got into the coop, you were out of luck. Egg production was unpredictable, and that unpredictability kept eggs expensive, seasonal, and local. Then Petaluma did something almost nobody else was doing yet. They started keeping records. In 1884, a local newspaper printed a small but remarkable statistic. 9 common chickens in Petaluma had laid 95 dozen eggs in 1 year. That's over 1,100 eggs from 9 birds. Today, that might not sound extraordinary, but in the 19th century, when almost nobody measured animal productivity at all, it was revolutionary. Because once you could measure output, you could optimize it. And once you could optimize it, you could scale it. Petaluma farmers began to ask questions that most farmers never had. Which hens lay the most? Which feed produces more eggs? What temperatures produce stronger chicks? What housing keeps birds healthiest? These weren't backyard chicken keepers anymore. They were becoming technicians. But there was still one biological problem standing in the way of true mass production. Hens. A hen can only hatch as many eggs as she can sit on. She only goes broody a few times per year, and she stops laying when she's trying to hatch. In other words, chickens themselves were limiting egg production. Petaluma found a way around that. Artificial incubators allowed eggs to be hatched year-round without a hen. By controlling temperature and humidity, dozens or even hundreds of chicks could be hatched at once on demand. And by the late 1800s, Petaluma wasn't just using incubators. It was manufacturing them. The Petaluma Incubator Company became famous across the country. Newspapers from San Francisco to Chicago referred to Petaluma incubators, the way people later referred to Ford engines or IBM machines. If you wanted to scale poultry production, you bought Petaluma technology. That meant something subtle but powerful was happening. Petaluma wasn't just producing eggs. It was controlling the tools that produced eggs. Breeding, hatching, equipment, process. Long before anyone talked about vertical integration, Petaluma was building one. And once the eggs started flowing in volume, they faced another problem. Eggs are fragile. They crack. They spoil. They roll. They smell. In 1895, a newspaper reported that a shipment of 100 dozen eggs, 1,200 eggs, arrived in Petaluma completely destroyed. Every single one was broken. Imagine the loss. Imagine the smell. So Petaluma did what it always did. It engineered a solution. Special padded crates, straw layering systems, careful loading methods, and eventually refrigerated rail cars. By the 1880s and 90s, egg market reports in cities like Stockton and San Francisco began listing Petaluma eggs as their own category. That's when you know something has become an industry, when the town name becomes the product. Petaluma eggs weren't just eggs. They were a brand. And that brand was about to take over breakfast in America. By the turn of the 20th century, Petaluma had something no other town in America possessed. It wasn't just a lot of chickens. It was a system. Most farming in the 1800s was still built around tradition. You fed animals what your parents fed them. You housed them the way your grandparents did. If production was low, you shrugged and blamed the weather. Petaluma didn't accept that. They treated chickens the way engineers treat engines. Every bird was an input. Every egg was an output. Every barn was a machine. And like any machine, once you understand how it works, you can make it run faster. One of the first things Petaluma farmers realized was that not all chickens are created equal. Some hens laid more eggs. Some laid larger eggs. Some were better mothers. Some got sick less often. So Petaluma breeders began keeping careful records, tracking which birds produced the most and which didn't. The best layers were bred with the best roosters. The worst were culled. Over time, this created specialized strains of poultry designed for a single purpose: laying eggs. These birds weren't bred for looks. They weren't bred for meat. They were bred for output. They were biological machines. At the same time, Petaluma was perfecting how those machines were housed. Instead of small backyard coops, poultry ranches built long wooden chicken houses, sometimes hundreds of feet in length. Inside, nest boxes were arranged in orderly rows. Feed and water were delivered on schedules. Waste was removed regularly. Ventilation was designed to keep air moving without chilling the birds. Light was controlled to encourage laying. Everything was about consistency, because consistency meant predictability, and predictability meant profit. Feeding, too, became scientific. Petaluma poultrymen worked with nutritionists to develop grain blends that maximized egg production. Corn, wheat, barley, and protein supplements were carefully measured. If one feed mix produced 2% more eggs than another, it mattered. When you're dealing with millions of birds, 2% is enormous. This kind of thinking, optimizing animals for output, sounds normal today. But at the time, it was radical. This was decades before factory farming became common. Petaluma was inventing it. And then came the incubators. Instead of waiting for hens to hatch chicks naturally, Petaluma ranches could hatch thousands of chicks on demand. This changed everything. They could expand as fast as they could build barns. They could replace lost birds instantly. They could flood the market with new layers. Egg production was no longer limited by biology. It was limited only by infrastructure. And Petaluma had plenty of that. As more and more poultry ranches sprang up around the town, a strange landscape emerged. Hillsides that once held wheat or grazing cattle were now covered in long, low chicken houses, lined up in neat, repeating rows. 6 million hens eventually lived in and around Petaluma. 6 million living, breathing, feeding, laying animals, all synchronized to one purpose. If you stood on one of the surrounding hills in the 1930s, you wouldn't see a farm town. You would see an industrial zone. But chickens weren't the only workers in this system. So were people. Thousands of Petaluma residents worked in poultry, feeding birds, gathering eggs, packing crates, repairing incubators, hauling shipments, and running grading plants. Entire families depended on eggs. Banks loaned against poultry flocks. Feed companies sold millions of pounds of grain. Railroads scheduled trains around egg shipments. Petaluma wasn't just producing eggs. It had become an egg economy, and the town leaned into it. Local boosters promoted Petaluma as the poultry capital of the world. Trade journals praised its efficiency. Farmers from across the country visited to study its methods. This was where the future of agriculture was being tested. But there was still one final barrier between Petaluma and total dominance: quality. Because no matter how many eggs you produce, if buyers don't trust them, you're done. And Petaluma was about to solve that problem in a way that would change food forever. By the early 1900s, Petaluma had done something extraordinary. It had figured out how to produce eggs in staggering quantities. But volume alone doesn't make an empire. Trust does. Because eggs are one of the most dangerous foods to sell. They look perfect on the outside. They can be rotten on the inside. They can be cracked, bloody, or spoiled without anyone knowing. Before Petaluma, buying eggs was a gamble. You could open a carton at home and discover half of them were unusable. Sellers could deny it. Farmers could blame transport. Nobody really knew. That uncertainty kept egg prices low and markets unstable. Petaluma was about to remove that uncertainty. And when it did, eggs stopped being a farm product and became a commodity. The key was candling. Candling is simple and brilliant. You hold an egg up to a bright light, and suddenly you can see through the shell, the yolk, the air cell, any blood spots, any cracks. In Petaluma, this became an assembly line. In large, brightly lit packing houses, rows of workers stood at stations, lifting eggs one by one to lamps, inspecting them in seconds, and sorting them into different grades. Grade A eggs went one direction. Lower grades went another. Anything questionable was removed. This meant that Petaluma eggs arrived in city markets exactly as advertised. Retailers trusted them. Restaurants depended on them. Hotels ordered them in bulk. And trust creates demand. Soon, Petaluma eggs were selling for more than eggs from other regions. Not because they were magically better, but because they were guaranteed. That allowed Petaluma producers to do something very powerful. They could standardize pricing. Eggs weren't just sold by the basket anymore. They were sold by grade. That made eggs tradable. Market bulletins in San Francisco, Stockton, and Los Angeles listed Petaluma eggs alongside commodities like wheat, butter, and sugar. Petaluma had created a brand that functioned like a currency. And once eggs became a standardized product, speculation followed. Traders bought and sold contracts. Producers borrowed money against future production. Banks treated egg flocks as collateral. The town's economy became deeply tied to the daily movement of eggs. Train schedules were coordinated around shipments. Ice plants ran to keep rail cars cool. Feed deliveries were timed to keep laying cycles steady. Every morning, thousands of workers gathered eggs from millions of birds. Every afternoon, those eggs were packed, graded, and loaded. Every night, trains rolled out of Petaluma carrying breakfast for the West. This was no longer farming. This was a supply chain, and it was growing fast. By the 1920s, Petaluma poultrymen were no longer thinking locally. They were thinking in terms of markets, margins, and volume. Eggs were shipped hundreds of miles. Contracts were signed months in advance. Production was adjusted to meet demand. The town had quietly become a food hub. But success had a side effect. It attracted attention. Other regions wanted to copy Petaluma's system. Large corporations saw opportunity, and government regulators began to take notice. Petaluma was about to reach its peak, and when it did, it would reveal just how powerful and how fragile a food monopoly could be. By the late 1920s, Petaluma no longer had to convince anyone. It simply showed them the numbers. 6 million hens, 600 million eggs, every year. Those weren't marketing exaggerations. They were operational facts. Postcards mailed from Petaluma bragged openly about it. Newspapers repeated it. Trade journals confirmed it. The town had become the single largest concentrated egg-producing region in the United States. And it didn't happen by accident. Poultry ranches around Petaluma were now operating on an almost military schedule. Egg collection happened at set times every day. Feeding cycles were synchronized across thousands of birds. Incubators ran continuously. Chicks were raised, sorted, and moved into laying houses on carefully planned timetables. The landscape reflected this order. From the air, poultry ranches looked like factories. Long rectangular buildings aligned in parallel rows, connected by dirt roads and service paths. Inside each building, thousands of hens lived in tightly organized systems. Eggs moved from nest boxes to baskets, from baskets to packing plants, from packing plants to rail cars. A single breakdown, a delayed feed shipment, a broken refrigeration unit, a strike on the rail line could affect the entire town. So Petaluma built redundancy into everything. Multiple feed suppliers, backup incubators, alternate rail routes. The egg flow could not stop. And during the Great Depression, that reliability became Petaluma's greatest advantage. While many agricultural regions collapsed, people still needed protein. Eggs were cheap, nutritious, and familiar. Petaluma eggs flooded city markets at a time when families were counting every penny. The town's poultry industry kept running when others stalled. By the mid-1930s, Petaluma had something even more powerful than volume. It had resilience. Then came World War II. Suddenly, food was no longer just commerce. It was strategy. The U.S. government needed enormous quantities of eggs for troops, allies, and civilians. Rationing meant supply had to be stable. Spoilage had to be minimal. Distribution had to be reliable. Petaluma could do all of that. Federal agencies studied its operations. Photographers like Russell Lee documented its packing plants and chicken houses as examples of modern American production. Those clean, bright candling rooms weren't just impressive. They were proof. Proof that Petaluma had built something bigger than farming. It had built a food system. But systems that grow too large begin to attract new forces. Regulation, competition, corporate consolidation, and the same technology that made Petaluma powerful was about to make it replaceable. By 1942, Petaluma was at the absolute height of its power. The poultry ranches were running at full capacity. The incubators never stopped. Egg packing plants operated with almost surgical precision. The war had turned food into a matter of national security, and Petaluma had become one of the West Coast's most reliable protein engines. Russell Lee's photographs from that year tell the story better than any statistic. Rows of workers candling eggs under bright lamps. Neatly stacked cartons stretching into the distance. Chicken houses laid out like a grid. It looks less like a farm and more like an aircraft factory. And in many ways, it functioned the same way. Everything was standardized. Everything was inspected. Everything was documented. But while Petaluma was perfecting its system, something else was happening beyond Sonoma County. The rest of the country was learning. Large agribusiness firms were adopting Petaluma's techniques and scaling them far beyond what the town could support. In the Central Valley, in the Midwest, and in the South, massive poultry operations were being built on cheaper land, closer to grain supplies, with fewer zoning restrictions. They copied the incubators. They copied the housing. They copied the grading systems. They copied the feed formulas, but they built them bigger and cheaper. Petaluma had one critical weakness. It was surrounded by growing cities. Land was expensive. Labor was unionizing. Transportation was becoming congested. The very success that had made Petaluma wealthy was making it less competitive. Egg prices were controlled during the war. Margins were thin. Producers who couldn't lower costs were squeezed. Slowly, quietly, some poultry ranches began to shut down. Not because they were failing, but because someone else could do it cheaper. By the 1950s, the writing was on the wall. The future of eggs wasn't in a picturesque river town in Northern California. It was in vast, anonymous industrial complexes far away from urban growth. Petaluma had invented the system, but it no longer owned it. By the early 1960s, the chicken houses that once defined Petaluma were beginning to disappear. Some were torn down, some were abandoned, some were quietly converted into warehouses, garages, and storage buildings. The eggs didn't stop flowing. They just stopped flowing from here. Across California's Central Valley and the American Midwest, enormous poultry operations took over, facilities far larger than anything Petaluma could ever have built inside a growing town. They used Petaluma's blueprint, the incubators, the breeding systems, the feeding schedules, the grading standards, the refrigerated shipping networks. But they stripped away the human scale. Where Petaluma had family-owned poultry ranches with thousands of birds, the new industry built complexes with millions. Eggs became cheaper than ever. Breakfast became abundant. And Petaluma faded into the background. Today, if you walk through downtown Petaluma, you won't see chickens. You'll see brick storefronts, cafes, restaurants, and a riverfront that feels like a postcard version of a California town. But hidden in plain sight are the bones of the egg empire. Old poultry warehouses, former packing plants, rail spurs that once carried millions of eggs. The infrastructure is still there. The story is what vanished. Petaluma wasn't just a farm town. It was one of the earliest examples of what modern food production would become. A place where animals were treated as units, where biology was engineered for output, where food was standardized, branded, and shipped at industrial scale. Long before factory farms dominated the countryside, Petaluma showed the world what was possible. For a few strange decades, a small California town quietly controlled one of America's most important foods. Not through politics, not through force, but through logistics, technology, and obsessive efficiency. That is why this story matters. Because when you crack open an egg today, in a diner, in a kitchen, in a supermarket, you're not just seeing a piece of breakfast. You're seeing the legacy of a town that figured out how to turn chickens into an industry. And, for a brief moment, fed a nation. When people think of food empires, they usually imagine massive corporations. Tyson, Purdue, Cargill. They imagine skyscrapers, stock tickers, and billion-dollar balance sheets. They do not imagine a river town in Sonoma County. But Petaluma quietly proved something uncomfortable. That you don't need a megacorporation to control a food supply. You just need breeding, technology, logistics, and quality control. And Petaluma had all four. For a brief moment in history, if you wanted eggs on the West Coast, they almost certainly passed through one valley in Northern California. That's a level of control we normally associate with oil or railroads, not breakfast. And here's the strangest part. Petaluma didn't lose because it failed. It lost because it succeeded too well. Its system was so efficient that it became the blueprint for the entire poultry industry. The world copied it, then outgrew it. And when that happened, Petaluma became a victim of its own invention. If you walk around the outskirts of Petaluma today, you can still find traces. Long, low buildings that don't quite make sense. Old loading docks behind restaurants. Abandoned rail spurs that once carried millions of eggs. Most people drive past them without realizing what they were. But for a few decades, those buildings were part of one of the most important food networks in the country. That's the real legacy of the egg basket of the world. Not nostalgia, infrastructure. Because the next time you crack an egg, you're participating in a system that was quietly invented here. By a town that once turned chickens into one of the most efficient machines America had ever built. If you enjoyed this story, this is exactly what we do here on Niche NorCal. Deep dives into the weird industries, forgotten empires, and hidden history that shaped this region and quietly shaped the world. From boom towns and ghost towns to industries that rose, ruled, and disappeared, Northern California is full of stories you won't find in textbooks. So if you want more true stories like this one, hit subscribe. And if you know someone who still thinks Petaluma is just a cute little river town, maybe send them this. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.